Well, welcome to both of you. Thank you for joining us today to talk about mental health. Really good to have you here. Penny, let's start with you. Very often, Christians will say, I've never heard any sermon about mental health. Does that concern you?
This is such an interesting one because I have never heard a sermon about mental health before either. And it had never entered my head until today to actually start thinking about that. I think my bigger concern tends to be, and of course you're going to have an opinion, and I'm going to bow to your opinion because you know so much more than I do.
That's worrying.
So it is instantly worrying. You are the important person in the room here. But my concern is that we're not aware of the impact we can have on mental health in our homes. And I think that's my biggest. And the fact that every conversation we have, every interaction we have, can have an impact on mental health. Now, of course, there's mental health, the chemical kind, and there's mental health, the I get nothing but negative messages thrown at me all day long kind. And I suspect they're totally different. But I think we all need to be aware of the impact that we can have on one another and our children and our parents and our husbands and our wives, first and foremost.
Yes, we all have a role and responsibility to play in the church, in this whole area of mental health, whatever the background might be.
We're very good at saying it's somebody else's responsibility, whether it be our school teachers or our doctors. Somebody else has got to be responsible for this, but actually it's not the case. It starts here.
Yeah, absolutely. Rachel, why do you think churches over the years have been a bit reticent to talk about these sorts of things?
It's interesting because you have never heard a sermon on mental health and I give them. So it's a slightly probably a bit creepy. Anyway, but actually, I think because there's not specific language in the Bible, the phrase mental health doesn't appear. We think, oh, okay, church doesn't need to deal with that. And I think as well, it's a lot around the kind of medicalisation of feelings. So it's one thing to recognise that everyone has mental health. Some people have mental illness, but everyone has shades of mental health. And saying that actually we have stuff to say as church. It's not in the role of psychiatrists and doctors, but actually the church has something really profound to say. The oldest mental health hospital in the world, Bethlehem Royal, is named after the birthplace of Christ. And I think that tells us a lot. And no, the phrase mental health isn't in the Bible, but the concept, and shalom in particular, so that concept of well-being and wholeness, is writ right through Scripture from Genesis to Revelation.
Are we afraid of it?
Yes, I think we're absolutely terrified of saying the wrong thing.
Yeah. And that's a challenge. I mean, you know, as a mother, you know the stresses that your sons had growing up in a school environment.
A lot of which I've imposed, I suspect. Eat your vegetables.
Why do you think it is then that we as a church are struggling to be able to stop and go, actually, we need to take responsibility for how young people are able to talk about their emotions, their struggles and their stresses?
Well, it's really interesting. I'm really interested at my own reaction when you said we're going to talk about mental health. And I just went, ah. And it's a kind of, I feel I have no experience of it, but I kind of do. And actually it's all of us recognising our own worth, isn't it? The fact that we all do bring something to the table. And when it's loving and compassionate and the kind of getting beside thing we bring to the table, then it's of value. And we have a lot to find out. And I think the truth is the church needs to be finding out, we're at that stage, finding out what it feels like to be in that position, which is why what you do is so valuable.
Tell us about some of the stresses that your son has experienced going through school so we can understand a little bit about what some of the young people are facing when it comes to battling with mental health.
Well, he is a Christian. And he arrived at secondary school. Now, the first years, for anybody that's got children going into secondary school out there, the first years of secondary school are the worst they will experience. And gradually things start calming down. Or this is very much for boys. Might be different for girls, but for boys, years 1 to 4, which that's old maths, sorry.
Year 7 to
10.
10.
Thank you. Is a really hard time because they're all trying to establish their place in the class. And the way they establish their place in the class is by knocking everybody else down. So he was coming home with stories about what was going on in class, and I was just thinking, oh my goodness. And you have, and the school was superb. They handled it incredibly well. I think the person that impressed me most was him. He was very, very cool about it, and he seemed to get that it's just kids, which I found really amazing. And there was one point which I'm always deeply ashamed to admit, where he had in RS lessons, he had talked about the fact that he was a Christian, and this was his role, and he therefore had another 16 kids pouncing on him because they weren't Christians and they wanted to knock him down. We're all very familiar with this concept. And I found myself, and I would talk to him about this stuff. And I probably interrogate him sometimes, poor chap. My shortcomings as a mother are there for all to see. But and one day on the way to school, I found myself wanting to say to him, sweetheart, don't be quite so obvious about your Christianity. And before the words were out my mouth, I felt God going, you really want to say that? You really sure you want to say that? And zipped it, thank goodness. But it's that relationship stuff. James has never done social media. He's not big on social media. He could. He's not interested. His friends find it hard to get him to answer the phone. He's got other things on his mind. Yeah. It's fine.
But for you in that situation, it was making sure you had an open relationship to be able to talk to him about the struggles that he was going through, to be able to help him come through. Rachel, there are a lot of young people who, when they're in their teenage years, they're not just experiencing bullying, they're also questioning their identity. They may well be in private battling with kind of depression, anxiety and so on. They don't always know who to go to and where to go to. What would you say about that situation?
I think part of the problem, particularly at the moment, is even when they do know where to go to, there's nowhere really for them to be referred to. The mental health system in this country, particularly for young people, is on its knees. And so even if they go to, their trusted teacher and say, I'm really struggling, the teacher puts in a referral, but actually there's a huge waiting time before they can ever access help. And I think what we need to do as church is to try and plug the gap earlier. So it's not that we are saying we can take the place of mental health professionals, but actually in your church, can you set up a mentoring scheme so that young people have somebody to talk to? And then if there is something kind of bubbling away, we might be able to catch it earlier. I think early intervention is so key when it comes to mental health. And it's the one thing that is really missing at the moment.
Yeah. Now, you know from first-hand experience what it's like to be a teenager kind of battling with mental illness and trying to find your way through it. When you were going through your journey, did you feel able to communicate something of your emotions, something of what you were facing to adults?
I did. And I think that is completely down to the fact that the adults around me were incredible. I'm also really aware that I was quite rare in that respect. I had a lot of really skilled pastors around me and some people who didn't have a clue what they were doing, but by accident did it really well. And my parents were brilliant as well. But I think what's important is that the world I grew up in is a world away from what teenagers are facing now. And it wasn't that long ago.
Can we just talk about that? Can we just talk about in what way it is different now?
Facebook came out when I was 17.
Yeah.
We had MySpace and dial-up internet and those things. And there wasn't the 24 accessibility that we have now. The phone... So
you could actually switch off to an extent then, rather than being bombarded the whole time.
Exactly. As soon as the phone rang, the internet cut out. Yeah. So you couldn't have that relentlessness, whereas now the internet is accessible everywhere. If somebody is being bullied at school, it doesn't end when they get home because it can continue on social media in a way that it never has done before. Yeah. And I think it's not about demonising social media because I don't think that's the only problem. But I'm hopeful actually that the next generation is going to be able to approach social media in a much healthier way because we all went into it with our parents completely blind because it was brand new. Whereas now we know the dangers. I'm hopeful. I've got a 4-month-old and I'm hopeful that by the time he's perhaps getting into social media, it's a much better place because we understand the danger as much as we understand the benefits.
Penny, what role then do you think social media can play actually in us as women feeling inadequate, feeling like we're not good enough as Christians, even perhaps feeling guilty if we're struggling with our mental well-being?
Well, there is that whole that we've talked about before of everybody puts up their best face on social media. We put there was a lovely campaign some years ago of dare you to put your face up without makeup on, and I did because I'm afraid that's how my husband sees me most of the time. Poor chap. So I was not afraid of this at all. But I remember somebody saying to me, "Gosh, you're so brave putting a photograph." And I said, "But everybody knows what I look like." And and sometimes we need to remind ourselves that people do actually know what we look like, unless the only way we're seen in public is social media. So it's one of those things. I think we need to be very balanced about it and wise about it.
Rachel, why have you felt it's important then for you to be open about your story and your battles and your struggles?
I think it's because as I was growing up, there were very few Christians who were talking about mental illness. And the rhetoric was very much, I had a mental health problem, then I became a Christian, and then Jesus healed me. And I was stuck in this place of saying, well, actually, I became a Christian, I had been a Christian, I got ill. Where did that now leave me? Because I didn't have a conversion experience to kind of pull me out of it. And learning that I haven't been healed in that sense. I haven't been cured, but I have experienced healing. And I've found that a really important distinction. I think I first read about it from a writer called Tanya Marlowe, who talks about the distinction between healing and cure. And the church is in the business of healing, but it doesn't necessarily mean that Jesus always cures everyone.
You arrive with no sight into church. You might gain sight somewhere along the line, but you don't. It's not a given, and it's going to be the same with mental health.
Exactly. It might be that you have an amazing kind of flash of light experience, but it might also be that, as with me, my healing has come through medication, through counsel, through family and friends, through me being more aware of my own emotions and limitations. So it's really interesting that I think our churches have to be places where we're able to be open. There's still this pervading idea that we have to bring our Sunday best to church.
Yeah.
And when I look at scripture, I just don't see that anywhere.
Yeah.
I don't see that.
It's interesting. The church that I go to, I remember a friend joining us, and she came for the first time, and she was choosing churches in the area, and she chose the church that my husband and I go to, and she said it's because it's not a perfect church. And there are some churches, it's exactly what you describe, everybody in their Sunday best, everybody looking wonderful, everybody being 100%. Whereas in fact at our church there are people who are struggling and they get looked after very well, but it takes such wisdom, doesn't it? And this is the...
Penny, you are very open about, kind of the kind of challenges that you face in your life, whether it's, kind of with humour and saying, oh, well, I'm getting older and I've got lines and got the grey hair and whatever. And why do you think it's important in our churches then that we're not always putting on this front of, oh, everything's fine, and we're actually being vulnerable and open about our struggles and our challenges?
If we can't be vulnerable and open with one another, how can we be vulnerable and open with God? And the way that God really loves us is when we're being dead honest with him. So we need to actually, and I think that honesty is something we have to learn to do. So I think it's something that's very important. And for me, it means there are no secrets. There's nothing hidden. There's nothing I need to be worried that anybody's going to find out, because it's all there.
Yeah. Rachel, I've spoken to many people who perhaps have some sort of mental health diagnosis, whether it is anxiety, OCD, depression, whatever it is. And once they get that diagnosis, a wave of guilt comes over them. As a Christian, they feel, well, as I'm a Christian, I shouldn't be having these kinds of issues and problems. Did you experience that at all?
Definitely. I remember, and I don't think I'd ever been taught, but I remember thinking, if I'm a Christian, I need to be full of the joy of the Lord so that people will want to become Christians from my example. And I thought, if I'm crying all the time, I'm not full of the joy of the Lord, therefore I'm a failure and I'm a bad Christian. And looking back now, and I talk about it a lot now, because actually joy has got nothing to do with happiness. Joy is the certainty and the surety that we are saved and we're held by God. I've spoken to you about this before. We cherry pick verses. The verse in Nehemiah that talks about the joy of the Lord is your strength. Yes, it is, but that's not happiness is my strength. That's who God is my strength. And I think it's really important that we learn how to approach the Bible again and say, actually, what was this passage saying to who at what point in time? Is there some of the language that has somehow got weirdly translated to us? And how can we hear it in its most authentic in its most authentic? What was the writer of that book trying to say at the time? To who?
Penny, what role do you think the church can play in helping us feel more comfortable about ourselves and to be ourselves in church rather than feeling like we have to have it all together?
Well, it's time together again, isn't it? It's back to this thing of time together, eating together, loving one another, supporting one another. I remember when I had a series of miscarriages, and on the 10th one I was an angry, quivering heap. And I had changed churches. And the first church, barely anybody commented. The second church, suddenly I found meals were being cooked for me. I was being loved. And I was being carried through it by being loved and supported. It's the amount that we can love one another is not just in nice words when we see each other. It's the way we support one another. We do things for each other. We care for one another. And this is what churches need to be doing.
Yeah, so caring rather than judging.
And I think all too often we think that when it comes to mental health, we can't do those things.
Yeah.
And actually they might be exactly what somebody needs. Somebody who's really struggling with their mental health might really appreciate you taking around a meal or picking their kids up from school. It's about having those conversations, like what will help you, but not being afraid to have that conversation. Just because it's a mental illness rather than a physical illness doesn't mean that you can't talk about it and you can't offer help.
I think that thing that you just said about what can I do that helps you is so key in so many emotional situations. And how do you like me to talk to you? How do you like me to address this? Do you want me to avoid the topic? Do you want me to talk about the topic? Do you want me to do things? It's so to have those really candid conversations that ask how you want to be treated is so useful.
Please go.
Because I think sometimes we have a tendency to swoop in. We want to help, so we kind of just do what we think is best, which is important because for some people they might say, I don't know what I want you to do, just do something, fine. But actually, for somebody with depression, for example, if we say, okay, we're going to bring you a meal rota for 2 weeks, but actually cooking is the one thing that they get enjoyment out of, we take away the one thing that they kind of are sustained by. And so it's having those conversations, saying actually what is going to help you the most. It also gives dignity to the person. So we're not just saying you're in a useless lump on the floor. We're saying what helps you know your own mind.
And I think it's interesting we give different examples. I mean, obviously you were saying about the miscarriage example there and the grieving you would have gone through with that. Did you find it difficult to share with people in a church situation about what you've been through?
I found it, funnily enough, difficult to share with all sorts of people because we all have our baggage, don't we? And the baggage that came with my series of miscarriages was, I am now not a whole woman. And I suddenly decided this was what women were meant to be able to do. They were meant to be able to have babies, for heaven's sake. And suddenly, it didn't look as though that's what I could do. So to actually express that failure to other people was very, very hard. Very difficult.
Rachel, when it comes to the mental illness, there will be some schools of thought, some churches that will perhaps say, well, there's some sort of spiritual root in all of this, or maybe even something demonic. How does that make you feel?
Angry, usually. Because actually, for some people, sometimes there might be something spiritual going on. Actually, there's always something spiritual going on, but that doesn't mean mental illness is an immediate result of that. I find it quite frustrating that with physical illnesses, our response is not do you have an unconfessed sin? It's go to the doctor. And yet with mental illness, it might be one of the first questions we ask. And I think as well that we have this idea that having a mental illness is somehow incompatible with faith, but having a physical illness is okay. And it's the same with medication. If somebody says, I'm diabetic, I take insulin, you'd say, oh, great, I'm glad that works. But if someone says, I take antidepressant medication, go, well, have you tried praying? And prayer and medication are not and never have been mutually exclusive.
Yeah. Penny, does it concern you that many young people growing up today don't know where to turn to? You were talking earlier on about the importance of people having sort of family around them to support them. For a lot of young people, they don't have that, and they don't know where to turn.
And they don't have that relationship within family. Yeah, it's something that, also, a lot of the mentoring that happens very often from churches is quite fragmented. So, for example, in Gloucester, we've got one service which is called Teens in Crisis, which is a superb service. But that's only available in Gloucester. And there's going to be something somewhere else and something somewhere else. So it needs to be made as accessible as possible, because very often that does become the one person that young person can talk to, can turn to.
Yeah.
What would you say, Rachel, to a young person who perhaps is hearing our conversation and thinks, well, okay, actually, I do think I've got some struggles and problems, but I don't know where to go with this?
I think pick the person you feel most comfortable talking to. And actually, it doesn't really matter who that person is in your life. So for some of you, it might be your parents. It might be a favourite teacher. It doesn't necessarily need to be the designated pastoral support person. It needs to be the person you feel most comfortable talking with. And they might have to refer you on or to kind of walk with you as you get other help. But actually, the best first step is telling somebody. And it's never easy, but the easiest way is to do that with the person you're most comfortable with. When I was ill, when I was younger, it was the RE teacher. She was the person who I wanted to talk to. And she was an incredible support throughout my time at school. She didn't have any official capacity as a pastoral care person, but in my school, you knew that if you really wanted a cup of tea and a chat, that's who you went to.
Was the person to go to.
Yeah, definitely. Also had good biscuits.
Yeah, well, that was the thing, wasn't it? The good big biscuits in the midst of it all.
RE teachers, is it back in my day? RE teachers never had biscuits.
Things have changed.
My RE teacher was a bit of a legend.
It's moved on.
Penny, we've talked about a few things that can help on the journey to making sure that we have, good mental health. Rachel's talked about the people we can talk to. You've also talked about the importance of getting people around you who can really support you, whether that's family or other things. As a singer-songwriter, do you find that actually writing songs can be quite a helpful way of just expressing your emotion and things that you're going through?
We all have our things, don't we? And for me, it is definitely writing. And for some people, it'll be painting. And I'm sure for Rachel, it might be writing. Do you write books?
Writing anything.
But writing
really.
anything.
Yeah,
a way of letting it out.
Actually, writing and singing, they're my...
It's processing, isn't it? It's that processing time. So for me, singing, writing songs is processing.
I found it really stunning watching the news last night as the fire kind of raged through Notre Dame, and the people singing hymns in the midst of it. And that was such a powerful picture, I think, because when people are in pain, they have to get it out somehow. And I think lament is a bit of a dirty word often. It's seen as kind of a bit, we pick one verse from Lamentations and kind of just stick with that one, don't we? But actually that was a really powerful picture of lament. And in Holy Week it was even more poignant.
Very poignant.
Jesus wept over his city, and I really felt that this group of people who came together to sing to God, actually we don't even know if they all believed in God, but they sang hymns to God as they watched Notre Dame burn, and there was something inviting God into that pain.
Yeah.
Rachel,
Yes.
There'll be some people who are in positions of pastoral responsibility, even lead churches, and if someone comes along to them and says, well, I'm feeling suicidal, or I've got a diagnosis of depression, they won't know how to respond. Yeah. So what advice would you give to anyone who's in that sort of position and just feels out of their depth?
I think it's completely natural to do so. I think there are a number of different things. Pick up a couple of books. You can buy my book if you like. But, Will Vanderhart and Rob Waller have written a brilliant series about anxiety and things, Dr. Kate Middleton. Get yourself equipped. Go to seminars at summer festivals. And lastly, get equipped with courses. There are a number of organisations, including Think Twice, which offer training and say, actually, this is the stuff that you might come up with. These are some practical ideas, and this is what the Bible has to say about it as well.
Yeah. On an everyday basis, Penny, one of the things that you've been trying to do just to kind of preserve your mental health and well-being is you've been trying to make sure that you have, time where you're switching off from screen time, not doing shopping, that kind of thing. So tell us about the impact that's had on your life.
Well, the whole thing of taking time down is hugely valuable for us. And it gets harder and harder, doesn't it, in this day and age? We're all so busy. And actually there's a little bit of, we feel we've got to be busy, because if we're not busy, we're obviously not got enough to do. And we get in such a muddle with it all. But actually stopping and breathing is so key.
Yeah. What have been some of the things that have been helpful for you on your journey, Rachel?
Writing. So having that space to just get it out. I wrote countless incredibly angst-filled diaries as a teenager, and now my prayers I write in general, and it's finding those things. For some people it might be music, for some people it might be sport, but find the way that you can get stuff, your outlet. Find somebody that you trust to talk to. And I think as well, we forget that if we looking after our physical health is a part of looking after our mental health. So getting outside, getting some exercise, eating some fruit and vegetables as part of alongside a slice of chocolate cake.
Chocolate cake's meant to be very good for mental health, I believe.
Good for most things. But actually, not seeing our mental health in isolation from the rest of our health is really important.
As I'm sitting here looking at you, I'm seeing this beautiful woman that has written books and does sermons, but has had a mental health issue. One of the things that's really occurring to me is how powerfully useful that must be to somebody who's feeling really depressed, to actually know other people have gone through this path and have either come out the other side or are leading a normal life. And I'm longing to know, from your point of view, when you were in the thick of it, was there somebody you could see and go, oh, she went through it too, that helps?
I'm not sure, if I'm honest.
Fair enough.
And a part of that is it was a decade ago, and so people weren't talking about mental health.
No, it wasn't in the same way.
Would it have helped?
Yeah, definitely.
It would have helped.
And definitely Christians talking about it and saying, actually, one really useful book I read was by an author called Abby Robson, who wrote about self-harm. And actually reading that she was a Christian, but she still struggled, was a great source of comfort. I was like, oh, okay, maybe this means I'm not a bad Christian. Which, incidentally, I don't think there is such a thing.
No, I think you're right.
That sounds like a whole nother debate and discussion, doesn't it? Is there such a thing as a bad Christian?
An oxymoron.
Rachel, would you just perhaps conclude for us just by praying for anyone who feels like they're kind of wrestling with all of this?
Certainly.
Thank you.
Father God, we thank you for our minds. We thank you that they are so beautifully and complicatedly created. And we ask, Lord, that you send your spirit. You send your spirit of shalom to ease troubled minds. Lord, that you put people around those who are struggling that they can open up to. That you open up pathways that they can access help. And Lord, that you, through your Son, have shown us how to walk dark and difficult paths whilst trusting in you, Lord. And particularly, I ask for those who are really struggling to see what happens next, and to struggling to find hope, that they will be able to look to you, the God of hope, who sent your Son to live a human life and to weep, Lord God, that we may find comfort in you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you both for joining today. And I think it's so important just to get, different perspectives, different experiences of what it is to really be honest and vulnerable in church, whatever we're going through, whether we're grieving, whether we're battling with depression, to realise that actually we're loved and can be accepted in that environment. So thank you so much for joining today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you've been impacted by any of the issues raised in this programme, Call Premier Lifeline today.